Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock urges in response to being called a psychopath, and I'm quoting here, don't call a person a psychopath when what he really is a sociopath. But if we really follow Conan Doyle's text, Sherlock Holmes is a much more complex character than Cumberbatch is presenting him to be. He is neither a psychopath nor a sociopath. Rather, he has a really kind of complex literary and philosophical persona steeped in Romanticism and Victorian history that draws upon figures like Byron, Goethe, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And in this episode of Anticlockwise, I will talk about all these influences and read Sherlock as a sort of a barometer of the late Victorian world. So there is no denying that Holmes is a difficult character. Dr. Watson, even before he meets Holmes, is given a warning by their common friend whose name is Stamford. And this is the very first chapter of A Study in Scarlet. And here, Conan Doyle is looking for a roommate and he gets to meet Stamford, and then Stamford introduces Sherlock Holmes by saying, and I'm quoting here, "You don't know Sherlock Holmes yet. Perhaps you would not care for him as a constant companion," unquote. Why? Why would not Dr. Watson care about Sherlock Holmes? Because Holmes is above emotion. He is full of reason. So we immediately see that he is kind of experimenting with dead bodies, whether they respond to external stimuli. And that immediately presents Sherlock Holmes as this person who is always cultivating a deliberate persona. He's always trying to be rational because that is what one needs to be a detective. I am Shubhendu, this is Anticlockwise, and in this episode, we will break down the complex persona of Sherlock Holmes. So who is a Byronic hero? This prototype actually originates from 18th century English Romantic poet Lord Byron, whose own life, which was marked by scandal, fame, and a rebellious spirit, and whose characters, such as Childe Harold, etc., they also embody this persona. Byronic hero is actually a kind of a moody, rebellious, masculine archetype, often characterized with a mysterious past and a melancholy kind of demeanor, single-minded focus, and they often reject societal norms. And we see all of that with Sherlock Holmes as well. But I really do not like the term, psychopath or sociopath being attributed to Holmes, because they would suggest that he is incapable of emotion or incapable of remorse, for instance. So if we look at, again, Sherlock Holmes's, the canon, Watson's work, then we'll see that in The Empty House, Sherlock Holmes is clearly apologizing that he has endangered the life of Watson. And Holmes again and again shows accountability for his errors as well. So in The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, he tells Watson that in that story, he showed kind of an error of judgment, a temporary eclipse, he calls it. And again, in The Sign of Four, which is the famous, book where Watson gets introduced to Mary Morstan, actually Holmes refers to Mary as one of the most charming young ladies I have ever met. But he actually resists the charm due to his commitment to reason. And this quote is really instructive here, and I'm quoting, "But love is an emotional thing, and whatever is emotional is opposed to the true cold reason which I place above all things," unquote. So he is deliberately choosing reason because he is a detective. He is not incapable of emotion. So again, as I said, that the Byronic hero kind of makes their own norm. They have their own idea of justice. They do not always follow the social law. And we see that a lot with Holmes. He frequently lets criminals go when he believes that they are not hardened criminals yet, they are capable of change, they are not full of malice, etc. So he prioritizes the idea of justice over a strict impersonal application of the law. And we see he lets James Ryder go in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle because he thinks that sending him to jail would only turn him into a hardened criminal. So he says that openly, that I suppose, and I'm quoting here, I'm committing a felony, but it is just possible that I'm saving a soul, unquote. And in the end of the Three Gables, he also does the same. He has this idea of personal justice, which we can debate. We can talk about whether, Sherlock Holmes think of himself, whether he's a megalomaniac, whether he think of himself above everyone else, although that is not the case, as I will show. But he is definitely not a psychopath or a sociopath. And then there are other aspects of the Byronic hero that Holmes also embody. For instance, his mood, his melancholia, he has certain physical features, which we also see with the Byronic hero. So in a study of Scarlet, which I think is the most instructive for understanding Holmes, Watson describes him as excessively lean, with sharp, piercing eyes and a hawk-like nose. And that is a description that we see with a lot of Byronic heroes, such as Childe Harold. And again, as I was talking about, we see him initially experimenting with the cadavers, whether they would respond to any external stimuli or not. So he's working at a laboratory at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and he's working in a lofty chamber. It's kind of literally the physical architecture is putting him above a lot of other humans. We do not see him with having a conventional training, although I know that in young Sherlock, he's apparently a student of Oxford and he's already very proud and arrogant. But actually in Watson, Arthur Conan Doyle's writing, in the narration of Watson, that is not the case. So Stamford says that heaven knows what the objects of his studies are. No wonder he finds solace in the Diogenes Club. So Diogenes Club is this group, it's kind of a club which is named after the famous Greek cynic philosopher Diogenes, and it's apparently a club for unclubbable men, so people who cannot fit into society. But that does not mean that he necessarily think of himself above everyone else. So we really see that Holmes has no friend. So he's kind of incapable of being extremely sociable or extrovert. So he used to mop in his room, so he used to stay alone. During his 2 years at college, the only friend he made was Victor Trevor, and that was only because Trevor's dog bit him on the ankle, so he had to talk to him. So imagine that the greatest mind in England in the 19th century spent his youth in isolation, working out his own little method of thought, I'm quoting. So his youth was dedicated to turning himself into this great man of reason, into this figure of detection. And in the Sign of Four, Holmes again clearly states, and I'm quoting here, I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental excitation. That is why I have chosen my particular profession. So he did not decide to be the detective because he wanted to solve all these great cases, but because he was plagued by isolation, because he wanted to have that excitement. And despite his friendship with Watson, he remains sort of an outcast figure, Byronic hero, singular certainly in his utter brilliance, that he's the only one in the world as the kind of a detective of that stature, but nevertheless he remains alone. And in the Sign of Four, we see all these aspects that make Sherlock Holmes a quintessential figure of modernity, one of which is certainly his boredom, his brilliant brain, and also his cocaine addiction. I think the opening of the Sign of Four talks about this addiction, where Holmes is seen injecting cocaine in his arm, and he has all these, there is a description when he rolls back his cuff, and we get a glimpse, sort of an anatomy of boredom and addiction, because his whole arm is full of innumerable puncture marks. Imagine that. And Watson is quick to note that what he is witnessing has been happening for the last 3 months. And Holmes continuously suffers from this kind of alternate of extreme boredom and extreme energy. So in the Three-Headed League, Watson notes that Holmes settles between extreme languor and devouring energy in the same story, Holmes makes the startling confession that his deductive reasoning saved him from ennui or boredom. So he really did not become the greatest detective because he wanted to save the world. He did because he was bored. Now we need to understand what Holmes really means by boredom more philosophically by talking about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So we use the word boredom a lot when we are scrolling endlessly our feed and we don't want to think, but that's not the sense that boredom had in the 19th century. That's not certainly the sense in which Holmes uses it. So in The Sign of Four, there is this great scene where he is looking out of the window and he says that there is nothing exceptional that he can see. Everything is full of a profound sense of ordinariness. And he is incapable of finding any excitement with that slice of life. And he says, and I'm quoting here, "I stand at the window here, was ever such a dreary, dull, unprofitable world. See how the yellow fog swirls down the street and drifts across the dull-colored houses and so on." So that world is extremely prosaic and material, and there is no space for higher mental energy or intelligence in that world. And that sense that life is essentially empty and hence boring, that actually resonates with the idea of boredom in the philosophy of the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard argues that boredom is a sort of a kind of nothingness that permeates all reality. He calls it, and I'm quoting, using it within quotes, demonic phantasm. It's demonic because it is that which is empty. He's using the idea of the demon not in the sense of their, devil and so on, but from the idea of the daimon in Greek philosophy. And it is also pantheism because it is all pervasive. So there is no sense of inspiration or nothing exceptional in the existence as such, but that precisely is the reason why we need to take action. The boredom is not incapacitating. It's not an argument for inaction. It does not suggest that we should not do anything. Rather, we should invent value or kind of insert it into the nothingness by action. So boredom actually functions as the highly effective impetus to action. We should act because it makes a mark upon this inherently meaningless life. And Holmes is a great example of that Kierkegaardian idea of boredom, where he decides to use his great intelligence and insert meaning into the profound meaninglessness that is the dreary, fog-ridden Victorian London. So what does Holmes do when he is extremely bored? Okay, so unless he gets a case, he kind of, as I said already, and we know already that he puts the syringe into his arm. Sometimes he also shoots there is this writing of Victoria Regina in his room and he shoots on it. So imagine that. It's a very rebellious act that he does. He's shooting the name of the Queen of England. And he's capable of kind of being extremely well dressed, almost becoming a dandy, but he sometimes is also quite shabby and he does not organize his room and so on. So he also fluctuates between these two ends. And in this story called the Musgrave Ritual, we see, for instance, as Watson describes his untidy and eccentric habits. And I'm quoting here because this is really hilarious. He keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very center of his wooden mantelpiece, unquote. So he is extremely eccentric. He does not reply to correspondences sometimes. But on the other hand, he could live quite a luxurious and leisurely life if he wants to in moments. So he is really a literary figure that develops in the late 19th century with aestheticism, that is most commonly kind of associated with the writing of Oscar Wilde, but also figures like Walter Pater and so on. And in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, we see that he is very fashionably dressed. He is noted for that, unless he is in disguise, of course. So he can fit into all these different personas. Who is a dandy? We see a description of the dandy in the writing of, for instance, Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, where the dandy is distinguished from the Flâneur, who is also another interesting figure of the late 19th century. So the dandy is someone who draws attention upon himself. So when he is in the public, he's so well dressed that everyone is looking at the dandy. As opposed to that, the Flâneur is someone who can be part of the crowd and remain indistinguishable from it. And Holmes, who is a dandy, as we see in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, can also be a Flâneur. So in the Adventures of the Engineer's Thumb, we see that he is kind of going into the crowd and mixing with it. And that is something that we see in his other, I'm forgetting the name of the book, but where he goes into this opium den and he's kind of looking into the dark underbelly of Victorian London. So he is capable of moving from boredom to fashion to being the man of the crowd and so on. And that makes him a really potent kind of microscope into the whole complexity of Victorian life. Yeah, I just remembered that opium book. It's called The Man with the Twisted Leaf, and there is a great BBC adaptation of it where Sherlock Holmes shows how people are living like this, leading kind of a double life, because there are all these different people who have another life and then they come into the opium den, or they can remain in disguise. It's kind of a larger depiction of the kind of thing we see in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that people are living these kinds of double lives. Sherlock Holmes also is a great scholar. He has a lot of knowledge, he reads a lot of books, and he comes from this tradition of the gentleman detective, which we see in Auguste Dupin as well. Edgar Allan Poe pioneers the prototype, who is also a scholar. So Holmes actually quotes profusely from Shakespeare, most importantly, and he apparently has quotes from 14 Shakespearean plays. And in The Adventure of the Abbé Grange, he actually says that "Come, Watson, come, the game is afoot," within quotes, which is actually from Henry V, Act 3, Scene 1. So he has this tendency of quoting from Shakespeare and sometimes even rephrasing them. So there is this quote from Henry IV, which goes, "Thrice is he armed, but hath his quarrel just," which he rephrases as "Thrice is he armed, who hath his quarrel just." So he has this tendency, but he also quotes from Goethe, and he says that Goethe is quite pithy. And he uses this quote that "Nature, alas, made only one being of you, although there was material for a good man and a rogue," unquote. So to show kind of the moral complexity. And he quotes from Flâneur. He also quotes from the Persian poet Hafiz. And he says that there is as much sense in Hafiz as there is in Horace. So he is quite a cosmopolitan man of culture who can find a suitable quote from a vast array of literary pieces quite effortlessly. So we saw all of these. He is bored, which is kind of philosophical boredom. He could be a dandy, a Flâneur, a man of culture, and he is certainly also a cynic because he is unclubbable, he is unsociable, he is this, his method is kind of his defense against his inability sometimes to mix effortlessly. And I know that in modern depictions of Holmes, he is always kind of speaking very fast. That was probably started by Benedict Cumberbatch and Robert Downey Jr., but that we see in young Sherlock as well. But he is actually quite a gentleman, very poised, and I don't think that kind of a fast, he's always kind of speaking fast and he has this kind of slurred speech. That's not true to how Arthur Conan Doyle wrote him. But he has a really interesting and tense relation with Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin, as I was saying, who is the first gentleman detective. So he says in a study of Scarlet that Dupin is a hack and he's a very inferior fellow and so on. But then again, in the case of the resident patient, he says that you remember that time in Poe's so-and-so book, in that sketch, where Dupont was following the course of the thought of his companion in such a way, and that gives us a great idea of how the detective works. So he has both admiration for his, predecessors like Dupont, but he also has a very complex relation with them. So he's a complex character. We'll have to accept that with all his great qualities and his flaws, but that does not make him a psychopath or a sociopath. I feel like we're too quick to judge historical figures these days, and we need to make space for that kind of complexity. So Sherlock Holmes inhabits a world where the moral grayness is the norm. It's stripped of any absolute sense of good and evil. And that brings us to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche also talks about a sort of a noble nihilism, where you need to create your own meaning in a chaotic, godless, or at least indifferent world. And in many ways, Holmes anticipates even Nietzsche in rejecting a single objective truth, instead favoring a perspectival view, instead talking about we will understand truth only from a specific perspective, with a specific sense of observational skill and interpretation. And that, quite frankly, is the abiding charm of Holmes, because, he does not brush off the grayness of life. He does not think that we need to really inhabit the white world or the black world. And detective novels' abiding popularity is related to turning that opaque world of grayness, of crime and moral muddles, into a puzzle, into sort of a laboratory where we can find a momentary order. And Holmes's boredom, his cocaine addiction, the fact that he plays violin sometimes even in a discordant way, that suggests that he lives in that complexity, that grayness of life. And the reader in different eras are compelled to return to that again and again. Thank you so much. I will again come with more bits of detective fiction. Till then, stay anti-clockwise.